Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today, and quite a great conversation. But I have real concerns over budget cuts because we're talking about research, amazing research, scientists not being afraid to fail. That's how science happens, right? Sometimes the failures lead you to a positive result down the line. They tell you something. And so we've seen how NASA's investments in research and innovation, STEM education, they fuel our economy, they strengthen our national security, and actually they're inspirational as they inspire the next generation of scientists, engineers, dreamers, and thinkers, and all of those things. We know what the space program has done for us through the decades. And so I'm concerned about the president's proposed budget cuts to key programs that have long delivered value, well, right here on terra firma, right here on Earth, specifically aeronautics research at the Armstrong Flight Research Center, ISS payload operations at Marshall Space Flight Center, and science missions at Goddard Space Flight Center, just to name a few. So Administrator Bridenstine, can you talk about the potential impacts of proposed cuts to just some of these programs I've mentioned, particularly as we're building on what everyone's been asking about, innovation, scientific leadership, leadership in general, our ability to respond to these challenges, economic competitiveness, aerospace advancement, climate, and national security?
Yeah, so I think it is important when we think about, when we think about NASA and the budget that it has, and you think about the size of the U.S. budget, we're talking about now an agency that has less than 1/3 of 1% of the federal budget. And by the way, if you go back to Apollo, it was somewhere between 4% and 5%. So we are significantly smaller as a percentage of the federal government than we were back in the Apollo era. All that being said, not all of that is because of NASA cuts, I want to be clear. A lot of that is because of the growth of government in other areas. And I certainly understand we have a huge deficit problem and we've got a debt problem, and I know that the president is focused like a laser on trying to get control over that. And by the way, I think everybody bipartisan understands that we've got to get control of it. I would also say it's really hard to balance the budget when you're talking about cutting a few $billions from an agency that has less than 1/3 of 1% of the federal government.
But I would argue with you saying that the economic development, the inspiration, I'm a child of the 1960s and 70s. I watched them walk on the moon. I know people that went into careers because of what they saw, and that still happens today. And so I would argue that there's probably a pretty good return on the investment. But we have a lot of other questions, so I'm going to just try to move on in my 2 minutes, because I want to ask you again about the future, this time of space stations. Because the request for proposals for phase 2 of the Commercial Low Earth Orbit Development Program, it's expected to define NASA's level of investment and commitment, awarding contracts to 2 or more commercial providers to ensure redundancy and competition for services. That is essential for driving innovation. Competition drives innovation and economic growth. So given your previous role at NASA, again, Administrator, can you speak about the critical need for these providers to be operational before the ISS deorbits? We can't wait to have nothing up there.
Yes, ma'am.
And then hope we're going to get something there. So how do we ensure the timely development and deployment of these systems?
I think it's important to note that we need to have space stations that can, in effect, replace the International Space Station. When I say that, I mean space stations that are fully mission capable and have a permanent human presence in space. Mm-hmm. The capabilities and technologies that come from human spaceflight are significant. We've talked about some of them today when we think about pharmaceutical development to treat diseases that have never been treatable before, regenerative medicine, the ability to print in 3D human tissue, to grow in 3D human tissue. All of these capabilities, if we don't stay in front of it, our greatest competitor, China, will, and our international partners will join them in that effort. So it is important for us to have fully mission-capable space stations that can replace the International Space Station. And I would also say, when it comes to advanced materials, whether we're talking about semiconductors or we're talking about hypersonics, microgravity is critical to all of these capabilities, and we're at risk if we don't have a fully mission-capable system, and if we don't have a permanent human presence at space, we're at risk of losing that to our greatest competitor.
And Senator, if I may, it's not only, you make an excellent point, enough that we avoid the gap, but we must have orbital capabilities that are at least equal to the Chinese. We have to avoid the gap and make sure that we are equal or superior in LEO for all the reasons Jim just mentioned.
Well, thank you. I think investing in innovation research, public-private partnerships is really important. Thank you for your time today.